Ah, Hollow Knight, sweet Hollow Knight. It is one of my favorite games ever, probably top 5 in my list. I've put more than 100 hours in this game, it's just that good. Of course, as any other piece of art ever made, it's not perfect. And one of the things people are most critical about is the DLC for lacking what made the game so special. Or in other words, no new exploration. But it can be excused because it was all free. The one people are most critical about is the last one, Godmaster. This DLC was purely centered around boss fights, basically a set of boss rushes. Why is it a bit divisive? Well, Hollow Knight's biggest strength is its exploration, that gigantic world full of things to discover, both in tools and, well, just the looks. This game is beautiful. The combat in Hollow Knight is very tight, the game is very responsive and the movement is really good, with good mechanics like pogging on enemies to maintain yourself in the air. But the combat of Hollow Knight is not really that deep. You don't really have a lot of options of how to approach combat. The charms and spells give you more options, but for the most part your attacks simply deal damage and don't have a lot of effect on the enemies, aside from knockback. It's difficult to explain and it isn't the point of this video, but to understand it I recommend playing well-regarded action games. I used to think that the combat in the Souls series was deep until I played Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance and Devil May Cry. It's something you need to experience and maybe someday I'll actually try to explain it in a video.
A good question. For another time.
In DMC, the Bloody Palace is somewhat similar to the Pantheons, just more focused on the normal enemies with boss fights here and there. Nobody ever complains about its existence because DMC is an action game with a very deep combat and incentives to play well. All of this might make you think that I'm against putting boss rushes in Hollow Knight, but I actually really like them. But why? Well, a problem most games normally encounter with boss rushes is your health bar. In DMC you have the Devil Trigger mechanic to regenerate health, aside from certain enemies being more generous with health pickups. But let's choose a game not based around combat like Hollow Knight, let's say Dark Souls. Imagine you want to implement a boss rush in Dark Souls. But what will you do if the player takes damage? The S2 needs to be refilled, so how many refills do you allow? 1 every 5 bosses? 1 per boss? No refills at all? Thanks to how the healing works in Hollow Knight, this isn't an issue at all. You need to keep yourself alive for every single boss, so you can't tank anything and you need to regenerate your life before ending the fight so you don't die in the next boss. Aside from that, the bosses are just really good. They absolutely make up for the lack of depth with extremely fun and very challenging but fair design. The way the healing works and just how cool the bosses are, and because it also adds really good new ones, is why despite in theory this concept not going very well with the game, in execution it ended up going very well with me. Besides, the Hornet DLC always exists for new exploration. Or well, existed before they turned it into a new game. And the DLC was free, so I don't see why so much cries over this. Okay, there is however an issue that some of the most critical people with the DLC will tell me. The pantheon of Hallownest. This is where most of the criticisms go. Why? Well, because it's them 40 minutes long. No stop of fighting bosses and the very hardest boss in the end. A boss that it's so hard it even got in this guy list of the hardest bosses in the decade. In what number? Freaking first. This thing took me like 2 weeks to defeat on Ascended, and to beat the Pantheon you have to beat her after every single other boss. Yeah, it's a pretty hard challenge, took me about a month to beat. What? Dark Souls? Dark Eater Midir? Get out of here, that shit's for children. So yeah, the Pantheons are hard, but let me ask you something. So what? It is supposed to be extremely hard. That was the point, that's why the developers wanted. You missed content? Dude, you played the entire game and beat the other 4 Pantheons and you're mad that you can't beat the hardest one by far? Oh, they locked an ending behind it. Well, you can do, I don't know, one of the other 3 endings? The developers even say there's no canon ending, they're all canon in different timelines. The Pantheon was always supposed to be a real challenge for the players that master the game. I understand that will leave a lot of players out of this, but if we go with that logic, then the game from the very beginning has been leaving people out of it. That is true for all video games, even the easy ones. My mom, for example, couldn't even move the camera in Zelda Breath of the Wild. I always hear all of these bullshit criticisms and not much about the real issues. Yeah, I also have problems. In fact, I made this video to imagine a different version, and better, of the Pantheon. So you see, the Absolute Radiance isn't the only new boss. When you fight the Mantises, the fight starts normal, but then, in one of the coolest moments in the game, the three of them start fighting together. And there's another moment where you're about to face Hornet, but the game surprises you with Nosk instead. Also, a small interruption. I like how many things this implies. Like maybe at some point Hornet faced Nosk and maybe Nosk used it to have wings, but Hornet chopped them off. That would be so cool if true. These two, well, four, are like powered up versions of bosses we never got to see, like Hornet Protector or the Dream bosses. But there's one key difference between these two, the Pure Vessel and the Absolute Radiance. You don't have to fight the Mantis Lords before the Sisters of Battle. You don't have to fight the Nosk before Winged Nosk. And you don't have to fight the Hollow Knight and the Radiance before Pure Vessel and the Absolute Radiance. It makes sense, right? Why would you fight the weaker version of the bosses if you're going to face the stronger one anyway? But it seems they didn't think of that when making this Pantheon, because you do have to fight two versions of each boss for the rest of them. You fight Hornet 1 and as well as Hornet 2. You fight Dung Defender as well as White Defender. It doesn't even make sense with the story. If you're fighting the bosses in their prime because of the attunement, then why would this have two primes? You also fight so many things that really don't feel like bosses, that it feels like they're wasting your time. Why do I have to fight the Moss Charger again? Why does this thing even count as a boss? Why do you have to fight the Dream mini-bosses that have like one attack? These guys were fine in the main adventure because they were a reward for exploring, but my god, they really don't have a place here along with their other real bosses. Oh, and Ascended Marco is the worst boss in this game. It's so bullshit. Please, never do this again. So if I use this video on the Fountain of Hallownest, because I passed it on my Switch, which I can't record and I'm never going to play that again, even if I like it. If you remove all the repeated first encounters, excluding the Moldek because the surprise is pretty cool, and Green because he is sort of a different entity from Nightmare King, and including wordless fights like against guys that really shouldn't count as bosses like the Magifly Kings, the Pantheon will be 8 minutes shorter. This guy did all the bosses pretty quickly, so believe me, 8 minutes is pretty significant and the brutal difficulty and the sense of accomplishment is still there. It just will waste less of your time. Whoa, I managed to do a video under 10 minutes. Impressive. Well, I hope you liked this more short video essay. Well, I don't know when I will see you again because next video it won't be very easy to do. Well, as always, like and subscribe, well, if you liked it. Consider checking some of my other stuff, and I'll see you next time.